They didn't say, "We're locking you up." They just said, "You'll be safe here." Safe. A word that sounds soft as a wool blanket but turns out to weigh as heavy as a steel door. Daniel held the keyring in his hand. The hallway light glinted off the dull metal. I thought he was just holding it for a moment like so many times before. But when he slipped it into his pocket, I heard the click. Small, but enough to tighten my chest. "Just temporary, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. "Until we're sure you're okay." Then he walked away, without looking back. I stood in the lobby of Silver Pine's residence, my hand gripping the empty purse that once held my phone and wallet. I waited. 5 minutes? 10? 20? The woman behind the reception desk, young, red-lipped, name tag reading Sandra, looked up when I asked, "When can I go home?" She frowned. "Mrs. Hale, you're a registered resident. Your son signed the admission papers." "I didn't sign anything." "He has power of attorney." Her voice was gentle, but it pressed the air right out of my lungs. They led me to room 204. The bed was smooth as paper, the blanket tucked in tight, the pillow stiffer than memory foam. On the windowsill sat an old photograph, Arthur and me on a picnic in 1983. Daniel must have brought it so the room would feel like home. But my home doesn't smell like disinfectant. My home is filled with the sounds of woodpeckers and the creaking of floorboards every morning. My home is located at 89 Willow Street, featuring rows of white daisies and a dwarf apple tree that we planted for our 40th anniversary. Now it exists only in memory, a locked house and me placed in a room without a key. I sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, Daniel's car engine started. The sound of tires crunching over gravel faded slowly, then was gone. No, I love you, Mom. No, you'll be fine. Just silence. Thick as the curtain that now separated me from the world. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because even tears know shame. They refuse to fall in a place that feels this foreign. Have you ever found yourself left behind? Right in the middle of the people you love most? If you felt that kind of cold, the kind that doesn't come from the wind but from the space in your chest, then you're not alone. Here we tell true stories about love, about loss, and about the small flickers of hope that survive. Stay with me till the end of this story. And if you believe someone out there needs to hear it, don't forget to follow the channel. We'll make sure no one is left forgotten in silence again. I lifted my gaze to the mirror on the wall. The woman looking back, silver hair, hollow eyes, the same face Daniel had just kissed, seemed like a stranger. I whispered, "Just temporary." But deep down, I knew, there's nothing temporary about losing yourself. That first night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow. Dragging. Rubber soles of nurses' shoes, the cough of the older man next door, the TV volume dipping low. Silver Pines never sleeps. It just changes shifts to keep watching. I turned to the wall, fists clenched. I told myself that in the morning, they'd realize there was a mistake. Tomorrow, Daniel would call. Tomorrow. But morning brought only the smell of fresh bleach and a tray of cold oatmeal. The first morning at Silver Pines began with a metallic bell, sharp and cold, like a fork scraping porcelain. I opened my eyes. Light slipped through the thick curtains, staining the ceiling a faded yellow. The room was still. So still I could hear the air conditioner's faint breath. On the bedside table sat a breakfast tray, bland oatmeal, a few slices of browning apple, and a glass of lukewarm milk. A small note read, "Take pills after a meal. Sandra." I didn't know who Sandra was, but her handwriting was crisp, belonging to someone who had no time for gentleness. When I opened the door, the hallway breathed out a familiar scent, a mix of antiseptic, detergent, and fake flowers. The TV in the standard room was playing the news. Someone laughed softly, then a cough tore through the air like a rip in fabric. An older woman with silver hair sat hunched at the end of the hall, eyes closed as if counting her breaths. I wanted to ask, "Are you all right?" But I didn't. Here. Silence was the custom. At lunch, I sat at a round table near the window. 3 others joined, 2 men and 1 woman, Helen. Helen was 90, one eye clouded, the other bright as a pearl buried in sand. She sniffed her food instead of looking at it. "What's this?" she asked, voice raspy but clear. "Mashed salmon," I said. She gave a thin smile. "Everything's mashed here, even our spirits." I nearly laughed. For the first time in days. She leaned closer, whispering, "Don't complain. They record everything. Say the food's bad and they'll send you to the psychiatrist. Label you with mood disorder. Trust me." I nodded. In her weary smile, I saw the faint glint of survival. That afternoon, I asked a young nurse, not Sandra, if I could call my son. She checked the clipboard and recited as if from a formula. "Phone calls aren't included in your care plan, Mrs. Hale." "I just want to tell him I'm alive." She looked up, eyes sharp as glass. "It's the policy, ma'am." When she left, I sat down, fingers clenched tight to stop the shaking. The word policy kept echoing in my head. I'd taught school for 40 years. I knew that when people stop thinking, they start saying, "That's the rule." That night, I waited until the wall clock struck 11. The hallway was dim, the shadow of the night attendant flickering at the front desk. The beige landline phone sat there, quiet and innocent, like a piece of decoration. I stepped closer, slowly. My hands trembled as I dialed Daniel's number from memory. 1 ring, 2, 3. A door creaked open behind me. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Sandra's voice, not loud but cold. I turned, forcing a smile. "I was just trying to order pizza." "Pizza? I'm craving cheese. Guess that's not on the menu here, is it?" She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "Go back to your room, Mrs. Hale. This isn't that kind of facility." I smiled faintly. I figured as much. When the door shut behind me, I leaned against the wall, heart pounding like a drumbeat. Not from fear, but because, for the first time in days, I'd done something not listed in the rules. Night settled. The TV in the lounge was still on. Someone was watching a cooking show. Occasionally a spoon clattered or rubber slippers shuffled past. Silver Pines was never truly quiet. Its noise came from sounds that never got a reply. I lay awake, eyes open, recalling every corner of my old house, the floral curtains I'd sewn myself, the porcelain teapot Arthur bought in Portland, the window scratch from our cat's claws. I thought if memories had sound, they'd play like an old record with a snapped string. Still echoing, but no one ever finishes the song. Margaret learned that at Silver Pines, silence wasn't a choice. It was the only language left, and within that silence, a fragile thought began to bloom. To escape, she must first pretend to surrender. On the 4th day, Sandra brought a white plastic bag into my room. "Your belongings from the old house," she said, placing them on the table before leaving without looking back. I opened the bag. Inside were a few lonely items: a worn moss-green scarf, an old pair of gloves, and a gray coat. The same one I had worn the day Daniel brought me here. I lifted it up. The faint scent of pine wood and Arthur's mild cologne still lingered. A small layer of dust clung to a fold in the collar. I ran my hand over the fabric, as if touching the version of myself that existed before everything was taken apart. When I folded the coat, I noticed the right pocket was slightly puffed. Curious, I reached in. My fingers brushed against a stiff piece of paper. Smooth, almost like plastic. I unfolded it. A Power Play lottery ticket dated February 10th. The very day Daniel said, "It's just a quick health check, Mom. Don't worry." I remembered clearly that morning I had stopped by the corner store for a ticket and a carton of milk. I used to joke with the cashier, "If I win, I'll rebuild the porch." I looked at the neat row of black numbers. For some reason, my heart pounded hard. Not out of hope, but because it was the last thing still truly mine, untouched by anyone's control. That evening, I quietly left my room. The night desk was empty, save for the ticking of a clock and the sharp smell of bleach. The beige landline still sat where it always did. I opened the staff computer's browser and searched for the lottery results. The page loaded slowly. The screen flickered. I compared the numbers. 1, 2, 3. I froze. Every single number matched. I checked again, once, twice. Jackpot. $48 million. No gasp, no cry, just a slow spreading warmth from my chest to my fingertips, like a small flame lit in the middle of winter. I was holding a secret big enough to change everything. Footsteps echoed suddenly. The night nurse, a brunette named Mira, turned the corner. I quickly shut off the screen, slipping the phone between two magazines. "Mrs. Hale? You're up late." I smiled, keeping my voice calm. "Couldn't sleep. Just came to get a glass of water." Mira tilted her head. "You took your meds, right?" "I did. Maybe tomorrow I'll sleep better." She nodded and walked away. I waited a few more seconds before exhaling. My heart still thudded fast against my ribs. Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The lottery ticket lay on the table, serene, as if unaware it carried a destiny in ink and paper. I traced the numbers with my fingertip, feeling warmth rise through me. For the first time since arriving at Silver Pines, I didn't feel cold. I wasn't the one who'd been taken away. I wasn't the one forgotten. I slipped the ticket into my coat pocket and folded it carefully. Now, if anyone asked what I had left to lose, I could smile. I had a secret. And sometimes, a secret is the only way to survive in a place where no one believes you have anything worth keeping. Margaret looked into the mirror and saw a faint light on her face. Not from the lamp, but from hope. And hope, in the hands of someone who has lost everything, is the most dangerous thing in the world. It took me 2 days to believe that the ticket was confirmed, 2 days to learn how to hide it. I folded it 4 times and slipped it between 2 old photos inside a wooden frame. They had taken my room key, but not the frame. No one ever noticed it. On the 3rd afternoon, while Sandra was arguing with the chef about lunch portions, I approached the front desk and opened the paper directory. At the bottom of the page, in small print, it read, "Miles and Freeman, Estate and Senior Legal Counsel." I picked up a pen, copied the number onto a tissue, and tucked it into my coat pocket. That night, I called. A man's voice answered, low, steady, the kind that sounded used to hearing desperation. "I need to speak about property rights," I whispered. "Your name, ma'am?" "I can't give my real one." "You may use an alias if you prefer," he replied. I looked toward the window where moonlight brushed the wall. "Clara Whitfield." A brief silence. "All right, Mrs. Whitfield. Where would be safest to meet?" I glanced around the white room. There's a garden behind the nursing home, all fake plants. "We'll meet there." 2 days later, at 2:30 p.m., I stepped outside under the pretense of getting fresh air. The garden was really just a stretch of concrete with a few plastic flowers lined against the fence. But in sunlight, they pretended to bloom. A man approached, mid-40s, wearing a gray coat and carrying a black briefcase. He didn't extend his hand right away, just gave a polite nod. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "That's me. Andrew Miles." We sat on the wooden bench. He opened his case and pulled out several papers, a notebook, and a small recorder. "First, I need to verify that you're mentally competent. I can recite the periodic table, solve an equation, and quote Frost if you like." He smiled, head slightly tilted. "Good. I believe you're perfectly sound." I told him everything. How I'd been brought here, the power of attorney Daniel signed, the house being listed for sale, and the lottery ticket. Andrew didn't interrupt. He simply jotted a few concise lines in his notebook. "Our plan will have 2 parts," he said finally. "First, we'll create a trust under your new name. All assets, including the ticket, will be transferred into it untraceable. Second, we'll file a petition to review your son's power of attorney. If we prove coercion, his legal control will be revoked. What do I need to do? Just a signature and some form of ID. Do you have one? They took everything. No problem. I can request a temporary record through your old teaching file. I'll need a photo, full name, birth year, and new signature under the name Clara Whitfield. He placed the form before me. I stared at the blank lines, then took the pen. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the new name. Clara Whitfield. Each stroke of ink erased a little more of Doris Hale, the woman locked away for her own good. Keep this secret, Andrew said quietly. Tell no one. Don't write, don't call. In silence, you hold all the advantage. When they think you're compliant, that's when you're freest. I nodded. He slipped the papers into his briefcase and stood. I'll return in 3 days. The trust will be active by then. The ticket will be claimed through my office. No one will trace its origin. When he left, I stayed seated. The late sunlight filtered through the plastic leaves, casting soft patterns across my knees. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel completely closed. Before heading inside, I whispered the new name once more. Clara Whitfield. It sounded like a door softly opening, and beyond it, perhaps, the version of me they'd never recognize. Margaret, or rather Clara, walked down the hallway hiding a slight smile beneath her calm expression. Sandra glanced at her, seeing only another quiet older woman. But I knew the truth. Sometimes the only way to answer betrayal is to learn how to stay silent without ever surrendering. Spring at Silver Pines arrived slowly. The tree in the yard had just begun to bud when the staff had already changed the curtains, as if the color of the fabric could pretend to be a new season. I kept playing the role of the obedient old lady, finishing the thin soup, nodding when a nurse asked if I was all right, jotting down notes in a notebook that no one read. Just when I had perfected that act of becoming invisible, Mrs. Lillian appeared. She came to sit beside me in the reading room, a place few visited because the books were old and many covers were missing. Lillian was slight, her silver hair neatly tied with a blue ribbon. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply pointed at the book I held. "Did you know Frost once wrote this for his wife after she died?" she asked. "I know," I replied, looking up. "Do you like poetry?" "I lived among poems. I was a librarian for 30 years. She smiled, a small, dry but bright smile. "Now I live among silence, but it has its own rhythm." From that day on, every afternoon, Lillian and I drank tea together. She brought her own tea bag, a licorice blend Silver Pines never stocked. I brought crumbly cookies I'd hidden from breakfast. We sat under the skylight, watching sunlight fall through the plastic leaves. Lillian told me about her daughter. She lives in Arizona and sends a card every 2 years. I don't blame her. The world is busy, and people like us are easy to forget. I nodded. My son told me to rest. Then he left me here and called it concern. She gave a soft laugh. They don't understand that love can become a prison if it's not paired with respect. We spoke about years gone by, about the smell of old paper in libraries, about the way older adults teach each other how to disappear, slowly, silently, so no one must witness the farewell. One afternoon, Lillian asked, "If you could go outside, what would you do first?" "I'd replant the apple tree." "Not buy a new one?" "I like things that grow back from the old stump. They understand what it means to be lost and grow again." She looked at me, thoughtful. "I'd buy a train ticket, sit in the last car and read until the words blur." "Where would you go?" "It doesn't matter. I just want to be the one to choose the direction." That answer stayed with me through the night. In my notebook, I wrote, "Freedom isn't an open door. It's the right to choose when to open it." The following week, Lillian didn't come. Her room was locked. Sandra said only briefly, "She passed away in her sleep peacefully. No funeral, no songs, just a nameplate removed and a rectangle of light etched on the door." I sat at our little tea table. The tea cooled faster than on any other day. I thought about our last conversation, the aimless train, the right to choose. Perhaps Lillian had chosen the quietest way to leave. That night I opened my journal and wrote, word by word, "If I leave in anger, they win. If I leave in peace, I am free." I closed the book and placed it beside Arthur's framed photo. In the silence, I heard myself whisper, "Thank you, Lillian. I understand now. Winning at life isn't revenge. It's living true to your heart." Outside, the night wind moved through the corridor. The plastic leaves didn't stir, but I knew, somewhere, something was really shifting. Margaret sipped the last of the licorice tea. A cup sat empty on the table. But she didn't feel lonely anymore, because sometimes a person only needs someone to understand them before they disappear, that they once existed. That morning, it drizzled. Raindrops clung to the courthouse windows like hundreds of eyes looking back at me. Andrew sat in the passenger seat, reviewing the file. He said very little, only, "You don't need to say much, Margaret. The truth can be simple enough not to require defense." The car stopped in front of the county courthouse, a small old building, but with a tall, serious facade. I drew a long breath. The damp cold sank into my chest. 2 clerks escorted me into the courtroom. Wooden benches, white light, no floral scent, only the dry smell of paper and time. Daniel was there. Beside him was Lisa, her face made up so carefully I barely recognized the daughter-in-law who once hesitated to wash dishes after Christmas dinner. Their private attorney sat at the table, briefcase open, documents spread out like evidence ready to deny me. I looked at my son. He avoided my eyes. Only when Lisa lightly touched his arm did he look up, offering the polite smile of a stranger in a crowd. The hearing began. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a steady, weary voice, read through the file. Andrew spoke first. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Margaret Hale, was admitted to a nursing facility without consent, without signature, and without transparent information. Her son, Mr. Daniel Hale, used a power of attorney signed under unverified medical conditions to appropriate ownership and manage his mother's finances." The opposing counsel objected, "Mr. Daniel acted in his client's best interest to ensure Mrs. Hale's safety and mental health. There is a medical report indicating signs of cognitive decline." I glanced at Andrew. He said nothing, only opened a new file. Inside was the psychological evaluation I had secretly completed under his guidance. "Dr. Chamberlain's report state certified," he stated clearly. "No signs of dementia were found. Memory, cognition, and analytical abilities are entirely normal." The courtroom fell silent. Daniel bent his head and whispered something to his lawyer. Sweat beaded on his brow. The judge looked at me. "Mrs. Hale, would you like to say anything?" I stood. My legs trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of months of confinement. I looked Daniel in the eye, not as an enemy, but as a child who had gone astray. "I'm not losing my mind," I said. "I'm losing my trust." No one laughed. No one spoke. The words passed through the tired air like a needle. I added, "They said they were protecting me, but protection without listening is possession." Then I sat down. No further defense, no accusations. The judge nodded and turned the pages. After reviewing the evidence, the court rules. The previous power of attorney is invalid. Legal rights are restored to Mrs. Margaret Hale. Related accounts and assets shall be returned within 14 days. I heard the gavel fall. Thud. A slight sound, but inside me it thundered. No applause, no congratulations. Just the late light slicing through the window, falling across my hands folded at my chest. The hand that had shakily signed Clara Whitfield now closed gently, holding something fragile, but real. After the hearing, Daniel approached. "Ma," he started, voice choked. I didn't answer. I just looked at him for a long time. Between us were no longer the usual mother and son quarrels. We were two people who once believed they understood each other, and today both of us realized we were wrong. I turned away, saying nothing. For some wounds, silence is a form of forgiveness. On the courthouse steps, the wind blew through my silver hair. Andrew leaned close and said, "You've won." I smiled. "No, Andrew," I replied. "I've only just been given life again." Sunlight sliced through the clouds, illuminating two trembling hands clasped together. Not in fear, but in relief. No drums, no flowers. That morning, Silver Pines only opened the back gate, signing a thin sheet of paper that felt like a belated apology. "You're free to leave now," Sandra said, avoiding my eyes. "Good luck." I nodded, not angry, not grateful, just stepping out. A black car waited outside. Andrew had arranged everything. The new house, the accounts, all of it in my name. No false identities, no passwords. I carried only 2 bags, one containing clothes and one containing documents, along with a small notebook filled with words I had written in silence. The car drove away from Silver Pines, past long rows of trees, through neighborhoods I had never seen. With every turn of the road, the name resident of room 204 faded a little more. By noon, when the car stopped, I stood before a small white house with a blue roof overlooking Lake Seabrook. The window was open, the curtains swaying lightly in the breeze. I set my bags down on the porch and took a deep breath. No smell of disinfectant, no rubber soles squeaking on tile, only wind and the quiet sound of water lapping against the shore. So real, it made my heart tremble. In the kitchen, a new teapot waited. The porcelain cup still carried the faint scent of clay. On the table, Andrew had left an envelope with a handwritten note. "It's time you lived for yourself. A.M." I made tea. The kettle whistled softly. Warmth spread through the empty room. Steam tangled with sunlight like a silk scarf. I smiled. For the first time in months, not to hide anything. Sitting at the table, I opened my notebook and wrote the last letter to Emily, my granddaughter, the one I'd once feared would forget my voice. "My dear Emily, no one should ever be seen as a burden, even if they move more slowly, forget faster, or love differently. When you read this, remember, true, love never comes as a command. It's what we give when we truly see each other, not when we try to live for someone else. I'm all right now. Don't worry. Learn to listen. Sometimes a single touch can heal more than 1,000 pieces of advice." I folded the letter, slipped it into the envelope, and wrote the final line on the front. "For the one who will remember me, not out of duty, but out of love." Evening settled. Sunlight spilt over the lake, turning the water into 1,000 tiny mirrors. I opened the window. The salty air drifted in. The breeze lifted the corner of the curtain, brushing my cheek like Arthur's hand once did. I poured another cup of tea. The faint scent of licorice lingered. Lillian's fragrance was still here. I spoke softly, not sure to whom. I was never small. I was only made to feel small. Now I can hear my own voice again. A sparrow landed on the window frame, tilted its head toward me, then flew away. I watched it go, smiling. Not the smile of someone who has won, but of someone who has finally found their way back to themselves. The narrator's voice softens, like wind carrying a final truth. Family isn't a place that locks someone up to keep them safe. It's a place that lets them remain who they are. I closed the door. The sunlight faded. The tea stayed warm. Outside, Lake Seabrook rippled gently, and for the first time in years, I knew life had returned to me its most incredible gift. The right to be at peace in my own name,